Happy Friday, philosophy students, and the last class at that. Let's jump into this lesson. You are going to have most of your class to complete your slides, which I'm sure most of you need to continue working on. You will also be able to answer your 200-word response question if you are one of the 9 students who have not yet done that. And there's 3 students who have still yet to complete the activity from a previous class. So if you're one of those students, make sure you stay on top of it today. And by the way, if you are done with everything, including your learning slides, please get ready for the test that we have on Tuesday. And I provided you all of the previous quizzes on Google Classroom as a way to prepare. So that's kind of like a preparing package there on Google Classroom if you're interested. Let me start off class by answering a few great questions that some of you had who completed the wrap-up from last class. So I asked if you had any questions still from chapter 4, and let's give some brief answers, hopefully adequate answers to these great questions that you had. One student asked, is it possible for someone to be working towards the good and still not believe in the existence of God? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Like I expressed in a previous video, I think the subjects or the disciplines that reveal the most about the Creator are obviously the physical sciences. When a scientist or even just a curious child, takes something apart in nature or goes out and really looks at something in nature and sees how it works and discovers its latent powers and abilities, they are naturally learning something about its origins or its creator. And of course, that's God. So they're gaining knowledge about God. Now, they might be clueless that they're really gaining knowledge about God. In the case of a child may go out into their yard and start digging something up. Maybe they're watching an ant colony march back and forth from getting food somewhere and then taking it back to its colony. And they're watching just the latent powers and abilities and functioning of creation. And in that, they're learning something about the Creator, whether they know it or not. A child's not thinking about it, though. They're just having a fun time seeing how nature works and how ants work and things like that. Well, it's no different with an atheist or a naturalist scientist. They could be discovering latent powers of, let's say, atoms, for example. And they could definitely be revealing to themselves and to others, the very creative genius and power of God within that. But if they don't believe in God, well, they just believe they're discovering how nature works. And you actually see this with some secular scientists. In fact, Richard Dawkins himself will say, when you study certain aspects of biology, like DNA, for example, he'll tell you it seems almost absurd that something like this could come about by natural forces. But then he'll go on to say, but there's no other explanation. The only things that exist are natural forces. And so we must attribute these almost miracle-like concepts and ideas to nature. And so I think a scientist who's studying, and even if they don't believe in God, I absolutely believe they could be working towards the good. Now, if they're not interested in the knowledge of God, they're not seeing it that way. And so for them, it's just knowledge. They're working towards the knowledge of creation and the knowledge of nature and that type of thing. So hopefully that helps that question. Another question was, is there a limitation for knowledge for any area other than knowledge of God? I think the answer is clearly yes. I've thought about this question multiple times. Gangadine says it on page 150 under B, the good must be inexhaustible. Gangadine says it like this, and I quote, A finite being cannot have exhaustive knowledge of anything, not merely of everything or of the infinite. So Gangadin says, hey, look, a finite being, which we, of course, humans are finite beings, a finite being can't have infinite knowledge of anything, let alone everything. So he goes on in that section, I think, to say, like, simply because of just the absolute inexhaustible differences between people and the inexhaustible differences in how we communicate and all of the situations that go on in this world, Gangadin is saying that, yeah, you can't have exhaustive knowledge of anything, let alone everything, and especially not exhaustive knowledge of the finite. So hopefully that helps answer that question there. Is there a limitation for knowledge for any areas other than the knowledge of God? I think the answer to that is no. I think the answer to that is no. We could spend an eternity trying to figure out the relationship between humans and animals, per se, and there would be like an inexhaustible amount of knowledge that we could continue to learn from that. I think that's kind of what Gangadin's saying there. But then when you add the fact that we could never know the infinite completely, in other words, God, well, that's just a whole nother level of knowledge that we continue to move towards. All right. Next question. How do you gain access to knowledge of God if you live in a country where Christianity is illegal? Well, this kind of gets theological now. This sort of goes back to questions like, what happens? What's the eternal destination for people who never had a chance to know Christ? Are they condemned to hell because of a lack of knowledge that they were able to get their hands on? And boy, oh boy, is that opening up a Pandora's box. There are so many different angles and ways that you could look at that question. And we don't have time to go into it here. And I'm sure most of you are breathing a sigh of relief. And you're glad that Mr. Baird is not going to try to tackle that monster of a question here. But do know this for our philosophical studies. I think the knowledge of God that I know the knowledge of God that Gangadin is referring to here is a knowledge that is in no way inaccessible to any human being. In other words, keep in mind Christians especially, we are not talking about biblical knowledge here. We're not talking about the knowledge that a missionary may bring when he or she comes with the gospel. We're talking about general revelation, not special revelation. Keep that clear. So any human being has access to this knowledge of God. In fact, I would even argue that someone out in the middle of the bush somewhere with hardly a speck of concrete or asphalt or Starbucks, God forbid, right, around them, I would say in a way may actually have more access to this type of knowledge of God than, say, we have as we're locked or trapped in a concrete jungle like Phnom Penh. Because this knowledge of God is revealed in the creation. Keep that in mind. Creation is necessarily revelation of its creator. So if someone out in the bush is just constantly surrounded by the beauty of nature, trees and rivers and rocks and streams and vines and animals of all kinds, and they're watching how all of this works together and the seasons, and they're watching seasons change and all of these different things that we miss in a city here, then they actually are exposed in a way to a lot more of God's creative knowledge than say we are. David talks about it in the Psalms when he talks about looking up to the night sky and seeing more stars in the sky than anyone could ever imagine counting, and watching these shooting stars and these celestial bodies move and rotate around by hours and hours and days. And he talks about how he just sees God's handiwork in that. He sees God's logic and order in the way that the stars and and moon and stuff work. Well, think about us in the city. Man, I look up at the night sky here at Camco and I can count like 6 stars. When my kids actually see a star, they're like, look, Dad, a star. Oh my gosh, a star, right? I mean, it's sad, but true. So this type of knowledge of God is actually more accessible to people that are, stuck in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, without, any Bible or any Christian missionary. So I hope that helps answer that question. All right, another great question. How is the knowledge of God eternal? It is hard for me to picture that knowledge is self-maintaining. Okay, I think this student is simply confusing that something must be eternal, the infinite. He's simply confusing a quality of the infinite that is self-maintaining with the good. So just keep this in mind, that the good is not the infinite. They're not one and the same thing. Here, what we discover is the good for us humans, because we're rational beings who require meaning, right? Chapter 1, chapter 2, don't forget that. We're rational beings who require meaning. So the good for us is the knowledge of God. And I would say that it's an intimate knowledge of God. Gangadine is not talking about a cold knowledge like the way you might know a fact of chemistry, for example, but an intimate knowledge. When we get to know the Creator, it's a relationship, right? That takes place because it's a person. The Creator is a person. So it's a relationship that takes place. This is the knowledge that we're talking about. God is not an inanimate object. So it's not the knowledge of, say, a rock, right? It's the knowledge of a person. Well, when we truly know a person, right, it allows for a relationship. Otherwise, it's just this cold knowledge, and I don't think that's what Gangadine is referring to. Although I would argue, and I think Gangadine would too, that is part of the good, is just a cold knowledge of who God is. Part of my knowledge of God is not relational. It is actually like facts about God. God is powerful. God is the Creator. God is infinite. God, that's not relational, but it is necessary knowledge about God as I grow in my relationship with God and come to understand who God is. Does that make sense? So knowledge does not have to be self-maintaining in the same way that the infinite, in other words, God, needs to be self-maintaining. Okay, hopefully that helped there. Next question. When we look at creation today with good and evil entangled to see God, do we simply try to find the good aspect of the creation? I would say a resounding no to this question. In fact, I would argue, and I know Gangadine would as well, because this actually comes from some of the chapters that we've already looked at in his book, that through evil, we can also get to know certain qualities of God. So let's say, for example, we experience something horrible like a school shooting, which recently happened. And then we watch as people come together, community comes together to comfort and show compassion and bring healing and help with the grieving process. So we see this great community come together through such a horrible tragedy. Then on top of that, we see people get arrested, and we see laws needing to be reviewed to see if they're strict enough, and people are arguing and debating about what needs to change. And so certain changes are in the works and happening. And if someone's still left alive who is part of the crime, then they're arrested and tried as a criminal. And so we see justice. So I hope you see what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is through this evil. Now God did not intend this evil to happen. God did not make this evil happen. But through this evil, God is still revealed because it's happening in his creation. Creation is necessarily revelation. And so when we study the interactions of humans, and we even see horrifying things like a school shooting, we also see how humans interact. And that interaction reveals something about God because we're part of the creation. And when we see justice served, that reveals something about God, because that's all part of the creation and how things work. I mean, have you ever asked yourself why we humans really seek justice? Now, some of us do more than others, but why we seek justice, right, is because we're made in the image of God. And so we have that desire for justice. Now, we have it in a very finite measure, but God has that desire for justice in an infinite measure. Why are we humans merciful? Why are people coming together by the thousands to comfort this hurting community in Florida who just experienced this mass murder? Why? Because there's compassion in us and there's mercy and grace in us. And why is there that? Because we're created in the image of God. Remember moral law 2? We are to think of ourselves in light of the Creator, not the other way around. So I would say no. I would say we don't just look for the good amongst the evil. We even ask ourselves, how does the evil in this world also reveal the Creator? And next question, if knowledge of God is the good, then why was Adam and Eve punished for eating from the tree of good and evil? Great theological question. I haven't delved into a study of Genesis in quite a long time, and I apologize. It's been years since I took a formal university class on the book of Genesis. But I would venture a guess from what I do know of the Bible and what I do know of my theology, is that they're not synonymous. Remember, we're talking about a general knowledge of the Creator revealed through his creation. We're not talking about something as specific as, say, the knowledge between good and evil. Adam and Eve would have had the most unrestricted knowledge of God through his creation. Adam and Eve are no different from you and me, folks. They would have needed to go, and they did do this, they would have needed to go out and work the land, and through working the land, through their agricultural practices and their husbandry practices, through their work of the land, they would have discovered more and more and more about the Creator of that land. And that is exactly why God said to Adam and Eve, take dominion. Genesis is actually where that word comes from that we've been looking at in chapter 13 here, dominion. Take dominion. Cultivate the land and reveal me, God said, basically, reveal the knowledge of me through the work you do in creation. That is dominion. We went over that pretty thoroughly in one of the last videos. And so I would say when Adam and Eve sinned by disobeying God and eating from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, that this act of disobedience was not in any way a type of knowledge that God did not want them to have about him. It was a type of knowledge that God did not want them to have about, good and evil, about the contrast between good and evil. But they still would have been free to learn everything they could about God through his creation. So hopefully that helps. And last but not least, a student asked, how do we know the knowledge of God we are gaining is correct? Again, based on a very general knowledge of God, not specifics like what we learn in special revelation like the Bible, but general knowledge about God, you almost can't go wrong, because you wouldn't be learning things like the color of his hair or his eyes. Of course, I'm joking. That's very anthropomorphic of me, right? God doesn't really have eyes and he doesn't really have hair, but you get my point. We're not talking about such specifics about God that you could say, that you could be like wrong in a sense. It's more through understanding creation, we come to know the Creator. You know, for example, have you ever stood at the edge of a beach and watched a sunset? I hope every one of you has. And if you haven't, please make sure you get out more. But Imagine standing at the edge of a beach watching a sunset. Through that experience, you learn something about the Creator, right? You learn that the Creator is good, and you learn that the Creator is beautiful and certainly can produce that which is beautiful. And you're looking at the sun, man. You're staring at this globe in the sky that produces, I don't know, some of you science students could probably tell me, right? Produces how many insane, like what's the energy production? It's something like 1 billion nuclear bombs a second or something like that. I mean, the sun's power is, and the sun isn't even, we know this from astronomy, right? The sun isn't even close to one of the bigger stars, right? And here it is, just like as powerful as can be. And what does that tell us about the Creator, right? It tells us that the Creator is infinitely powerful beyond what we could even imagine. I mean, if the Creator brought this thing, this sun, which is so powerful, into existence, well, how much more powerful then is the Creator, right? And then when we get into things like, we bend down on the beach and we pick up a handful of sand and we think about just how vast creation is and how we couldn't possibly know, if our lives depended on it, we couldn't know how many grains of sand are there on the seashore. But then to come to understand that the Creator would have this inexhaustible knowledge, this infinite knowledge of its creation, and how, I mean, it just goes on and on. Do you see that? That's the kind of knowledge of God that we're talking about here when we're talking about creation being necessarily revelation of God. And there are some specific things we can know about God through the creation. Go back to our illustration of the recent shooting. When we see humans coming together in community with love and devotion and compassion, right? We learn something about God through that. We learn something about his character. When we look horrified at the news at that shooting and we weep for those people, and we think about what if it happened in our own community, and our hearts break, and we think, we want justice. We want this to stop. We need tighter gun laws. We need new politicians if that's what it takes. We need people to put down their weapons and, whatever. When we cry out for justice like that, that tells us something about the Creator. You see? So I'm not sure, like, if we're getting wrong information, right? I think we're interpreting the creation wrongly then. I think that's how you could look at it. So, for example, if you looked at the recent shooting in Florida and said, see, here's what I learned about God. He likes to shoot people. You would obviously be interpreting the creation wrongly and then attributing that to God. And so, yeah. All right, well, I hope this helps. This is the longest part of the video. Now let me just rush through. Don't forget, you guys need to know these moral law summaries for your test. I'll repeat that again. You need to know these moral law summaries for the test. Do you have to have them exactly word for word perfect? No, but I mean, not far off, right? If you're too far off, then it's not even the same thing. So, but I'm not, like, if you forget an and or a the or whatever, I'm not going to take off points for something like that. Okay. Our winner is Karen. Karen said this, and I tweaked it just a little bit, but it's still basically all Karen's. So she said this for the summary. To achieve the good, one needs to work. By working and putting effort in everything we do, we gain knowledge. We know that there is an infinite being responsible for creation. Therefore, as we work, we should gain knowledge of the infinite being who is revealed in creation. Brilliant summary, Karen. Thank you so much. So make sure you understand this summary as well. going into the test on Tuesday. Okay, you know what group you're in, and I bet most of you still need to tweak or work on these slides a little bit. So please make sure your hand is to the plow and you are working for the rest of this class, all right? There's still a handful of you, I think 9, that need to make sure you do your 200-word response to one of these questions. Please feel free to use this class time to do that. And then for those of you who are done with all of your assignments in this class, great, good job. Please make sure you're prepared for your unit test on the 27th. And don't forget, I included all of our old quizzes in one announcement on Google Classroom. So feel free to click into any of those and use those as practice for the test. Don't forget, you also have a book review due March 5th. Boy, that is creeping up fast, isn't it? So hopefully you're well into your book and you can also be working on your book review. So you got plenty to do. So have at it. Have a great weekend. Do get some exercise this weekend. Don't forget to put down the Coke and eat some spinach. And I will see you on Monday. Peace out.